Opening the center for rapid development and influence, this pawn thrust immediately challenges black's response. Opens up diagonal aggression, instantly challenging central dominance and signaling a dynamic, combative encounter. Opening up lines for development and challenging the flank, this knight prepares for a central struggle. Unlocking the queen's bishop and solidifying the center is a logical step, preparing for counterplay. Opening the center immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims for active piece play. Opening the center with this capture immediately leads to a race for development and active piece play. Instantly contesting central space, white's knight gallops forward, ready to challenge black's established pawn structure and prepare for further development. Developing the knight to f6 challenges the central knight, preparing for potential pawn advances and centralizing black's forces effectively. Securing the knight's central presence here sharpens white's grip and prepares further development. Preparing for queenside expansion, this move subtly challenges white's central control while offering no immediate tactical fireworks. Developing the bishop here prepares castling, aiming for a solid central structure and freeing the queen. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing development, this move prepares to contest the center and get the kingside pieces into the game. Probing the queenside is the idea, potentially preventing black's queenside expansion while creating space for white's own pieces to maneuver. Anchoring the knight to the center, this move subtly reinforces black's pawn structure while preparing for pawn breaks. Securing the king's safety allows immediate focus on developing the queenside pieces and challenging black's central control. Bringing the queen to the center prepares for queenside expansion while offering an escape square should the d-pawn advance. This redeployment of the knight to b3 subtly prepares for a central pawn push or opens a diagonal for the queen. Initiating queenside expansion, black subtly prepares to contest the open queenside files and potentially support a future b5 advance. Aggressively staking claim to central space, this move prepares an onslaught on the kingside while potentially weakening the d4 square. Developing the bishop to b7 now solidifies the c-pawn and prepares for potential queenside pressure, while also offering a crucial defensive post. The pawn's aggressive advance creates an immediate imbalance, seeking to pry open lines towards black's king. A defensive maneuver, solidifying kingside protection and preparing for potential pawn pushes or piece redistribution. Opening the f-file creates immediate pressure, forcing black to decide between simplifying or allowing white greater central influence. Reclaiming the e6 pawn opens up a diagonal for the queen, but it also creates a target on that square. Unleashing a kingside attack with tempo, this check forces black's king into a more exposed position, potentially disrupting pawn structure. This defensive maneuver attempts to alleviate immediate pressure, though it significantly compromises kingside pawn structure and leaves the king exposed to the bishop's diagonal. Opening the g-file creates immediate attacking potential against black's king. Unleashing the bishop from its cramped position on c8, this maneuver aims to develop pieces and challenge white's central influence. Shifting the bishop aggressively aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses around the king. Challenging white's regal protection, this rook advances to secure a crucial file, eyeing potential weaknesses around the opponent's king. Targeting the weakened dark squares and preparing to exploit the open files. Exchanges the attacking knight for a defender, simplifying the position and opening the h-file for white's queen. Unleashing the queen here opens a direct assault line towards black's vulnerable king, forcing immediate defensive adjustments. This knight's journey is a bold redirection, seeking to disrupt white's kingside pressure and contest the central squares. Shielding the king's escape squares while preparing for a central push, this maneuver dictates future pawn advances. Seeking to activate the rook on a forgotten file, this maneuver anticipates a potential kingside assault and aims to contest central space. Sacrificing the queen to unleash a devastating mating attack against an exposed black king is a bold gamble, aiming to exploit the open diagonals and weakened pawn structure. a desperate attempt to activate a dormant rook, hoping to create attacking chances before the king's safety becomes truly untenable. Liberating the bishop to target the weakened kingside squares creates immediate pressure. Sacrificing the exchange opens critical lines, but exposes your king to immediate danger. Opening the f-file now dramatically increases attacking chances against black's exposed king. This queen repositioning prepares for crucial central pawn exchanges, aiming to unravel the king's safety. Unleashing a desperate check, seeking to disrupt black's nascent piece coordination and perhaps force an unforeseen simplification. Placing the king on d7 unlocks a vital diagonal for the queen and prepares to connect the rooks, a necessary step for any endgame aspiration. Unleashing the knight to the center, the plan is to dominate crucial squares and exploit the exposed black monarch. The king's central exodus on c7 creates a precarious outpost, inviting a swift repositioning of white's forces. The rook's repositioning clears the path for a decisive kingside assault. Securing the back rank with the rook feels a bit like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. The immediate threats are far too pressing to ignore. Relocating the knight to a more active central post, preparing for potential pressure on the queenside or king's flank. Simplifies to an endgame where black's pieces are more active, aiming to exploit the open king's defense. Reclaiming the open file swiftly solidifies control and prepares for pressure on the weakened queenside. Assessing king's safety and piece activity, this maneuver initiates a crucial defensive consolidation. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, this move prepares to support a potential king march. The rook shifts, seeking shelter and a new line of attack along the 7th rank, a subtle repositioning amidst the chaos. Unleashing a fork to disrupt black's queenside and gain material advantage. Sacrificing the queen for immediate material and initiative, aiming to dismantle the opponent's king's safety. The check forces the king into a precarious corner, opening avenues for a decisive attack on the king's weakened defenses. King seeks refuge, but the open files offer little solace from the relentless white attack. Decisive material gain, unleashing queenside pressure seals the deal, leaving black's king exposed. Securing the king's central evacuation route after the pawn sacrifice provides a crucial escape, though the position remains perilous. Reasserting control of the critical central files creates overwhelming pressure on black's exposed king. Opening the e-file now seems like a desperate attempt to break through, but it leaves your king terribly exposed. This counterattack, while seemingly aggressive, exposes the white king to severe danger after the forced exchanges. Suddenly, black injects chaos, forcing the white king into a vulnerable dancing act across the board. Securing the monarch atop the ranks offers respite from immediate checks, a crucial consolidation before regrouping forces. Exchanging queens on this dark square dramatically simplifies the position, aiming to exploit white's exposed king. The file closure seals black's king behind a wall of pawns, a promising endgame shift. The black king, now a target, scrambles for safety amidst the open files and white's active rooks. Securing the king's safety becomes paramount as the queens are off the board. Opening the queenside flank creates active counterplay, disrupting white's pawn structure and offering escape routes for black's king. This pawn push seeks to restrict black's bishop and gain queenside space, potentially isolating the rook. Opening the b-file now offers a sliver of counterplay, preventing white's pawn advance from dominating the queenside. This rook repositions to gain control of the central files, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and initiate an attack. The king ventures forth, seeking shelter or perhaps a daring counterattack amidst the chaos. Seizing open lines, this rook maneuver threatens to dismantle black's weakened pawn structure, potentially forcing a swift material advantage. Bolstering the king's safety with a pawn advance is a wise defensive maneuver in this tense endgame. Fortifying the queenside pawn chain solidifies white's territorial gains. The rook now aims to disrupt white's pawn structure on the queenside, hoping to create weaknesses. The king's centralization now offers surprising defensive and offensive potential. Capturing the pawn initiates a potentially messy endgame, prioritizing material gain over positional harmony. Dislodging the enemy king from his protected perch offers immediate tactical leverage. King exposed on the edge, this maneuver invites a decisive pawn advance, opening lines for the rook. Slinging the rook across to deliver a check is a decisive pawn capture that seals the material advantage, forcing an endgame where white's passed pawn will be a major threat. The black king, having ventured so far, now faces a critical juncture, needing to retreat to safer pastures to avoid further skirmishes. The king ventures out, aiming to escort the rooks and disrupt black's newfound activity. Reinforcing the queenside pawn structure and preparing to activate the rook into the open files. The rook repositions to eye the d-file, preparing to join the queenside pressure. Initiating pawn thrust to secure space and potentially threaten white's rook on the queenside. Focusing the king on the queenside secures the advantage and prepares to mop up the weak pawns. Forcing a king sortie will likely create weaknesses around white's monarch. Securing the monarch's safety from immediate danger is paramount after that aggressive pawn push. A desperate attempt to activate the queen and create a passed pawn. Securing that pawn on a4 stabilizes the queenside, limiting black's counterplay. The king boldly ventures into the enemy's territory, seeking to disrupt white's advanced pawn structure and create counterplay. Solidifying the kingside pawns creates a secure fortress against black's persistent pawn advances. Shifting the king toward the queenside pawns offers a bit more safety and preparation for potential pawn advances. Unlocking the king's escape route opens up endgame possibilities. Shifting the king here tries to salvage the pawn structure and maybe create a passed pawn, a bold attempt. Seizing the open file with the rook offers attacking potential. Seeking to disrupt white's centralized rook and potentially create a passed pawn on the file. Sacrificing the pawn opens a critical diagonal, aiming to exploit the opponent's exposed monarch in the simplified endgame. Opening up the rook to challenge the advanced pawn is a bold strategic choice. The king's exposed position near the kingside is now a major target. The king bravely steps into the fray, seeking active participation in the endgame's skirmish. Securing the king's escape route through the open files strengthens your endgame position. Pushing the rook forward seeks active counterplay, attempting to exploit the now vulnerable kingside. The king's exposure is a critical factor as the rook forces a check, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares and gain a decisive advantage in the closing stages. The king desperately seeks refuge on the queenside, hoping to avoid the rook's aggressive pursuit. The exposed black monarch now faces a relentless radial attack, with the rook directly on the king's 7th rank. King's safety is paramount. The monarch's exposed position now invites further pressure. The king is herded to the edge, its safety compromised by this persistent pressure. Trading the rook for the bishop here only consolidates white's immense pawn majority, leading to a decisive advantage. Relocating the rook to the 3rd rank solidifies control of that corridor, preventing further pawn infiltration. Doubling down on defense, black aims to reinforce the critical light squares around their monarch. Opening the king's defensive shield further to potentially create mating threats. Unleashing a pawn push to try and break white's stranglehold on the kingside. Sacrificing the pawn opens a path for the rook to become far more active on the kingside. Black seeks to disrupt white's king's defense by bringing their rook into closer proximity, aiming to exploit the open files. This king's repositioning aims to support the passed pawn and squeeze black's defenses. Leveraging the open g-file for a rook infiltration, aiming to disrupt white's kingside structure. Repositioning the rook to the d-file immediately exerts pressure, seeking to exploit the open lines and potentially create further breakthroughs against black's weakened structure. Seizing control of the open g-file offers significant attacking potential against white's king. Bringing the rook into a more active role, aiming to pressure black's vulnerable pawns and restrict their piece mobility. Clearing the kingside path creates a dangerous passed pawn and opens lines for the rook. Opening the c-file promises potential infiltration, forcing black's rooks into a defensive shell. The black king now seeks refuge from the persistent rook pressure, but its repositioning feels defensive. Consolidating the pawn majority by forcing its advance now creates overwhelming pressure on black's queenside. The rook retreats, preparing for a potential pawn push or defense on the kingside. A bold push to seize the initiative, aiming to cramp black's position. Pushing the rook forward aims to activate it, but leaves the kingside pawn structure vulnerable to white's rook. A decisive push to secure the passed pawn's advance. Propping up the pawn chain with this rook provides vital defensive stability. A final flourish to usher the king towards its demise. King's safety is paramount. Black desperately needs to escape the queen's watchful eye. King finds a safe haven on the queen side, preparing to support the advancing pawns. Unleashing a potent rook on the open file, black aims to harass the exposed white king and disrupt its defenses. Propelling the pawn forward opens a critical diagonal for the rook. Securing the knight's outpost on g6 is a sound defensive maneuver, aiming to consolidate black's position after a tough sequence. Unlocking a critical open file for the rook offers renewed attacking potential against black's isolated king. A final desperate attempt to stir up a bit of chaos, hoping for a blunder in the simplified position. A final repositioning to prepare for the pawn endgame by eyeing the critical central squares. Pushing the rook back to its starting square now allows white to create an unstoppable passed pawn on the b-file. Sealing the king's fate with a decisive pawn thrust, the opposition is broken.